Well, thank you all for being here, Jen Kuya, especially to Lori for inviting me. It's a great honor to be here. I have been on sabbatical for the last year. I was dean for 10 years. So this is my first project moving back into my professional scholarly life. And it is a bit of a labor of love. My family's roots are in this neighborhood. My grandparents and my father and aunts and uncles all grew up, on many streets. They sort of bounced around a lot, but Seacott was the main street that they lived on. And as I was telling folks, I wish I would have learned a bit more about this incident when they were all still alive, because I'm sure they would have had much to tell me in relation to this strike, which I think is a really compelling story. It's not something a lot of people know about. And so I'm going to tell you a bit about it today. And if you don't mind, I took the trouble of writing a really, I thought, good story. So I may just read this to you. And if you have questions, we'll save time at the end for them. And hopefully you'll find some of the images interesting as well. So I dedicate this to my grandparents. If you're listening, hopefully you're proud. All right, let me set the scene. A dense blanket of gray clouds and the pungent stench of factory smoke enveloped the gritty working class neighborhood near the intersection of Michigan Avenue and Livernois on Detroit's southwest side on the early spring morning of Wednesday, March 30th, 1938. Heavily populated by Poles who had streamed into the city over the previous 2 decades, the neighborhood, ensconced in the nation's preeminent industrial cities, most heavily industrialized area, was notable for its density of meticulously maintained homes, replete with tidy, fastidiously tended garden plots surrounding the stately parish churches that served the spiritual needs of the community. Numerous tight-knit, ethnically based community organizations and locally owned businesses catering to the area's Polish denizens lined the main thoroughfares bisecting the neighborhood, with many more embedded comfortably into the surrounding residential streets. The most ubiquitous of these small establishments were the countless corner bars and groceries that sprouted up like mushrooms on every neighborhood street. My dad's favorite haunt was just up Martin Street, Stempine's Lounge. Yes. Made many a trip there to retrieve him. Here in these streets and in these businesses, the cadence of the residents' native tongue resonated comfortably through familiar communal spaces. The neighborhood was, in many respects, a microcosmic reflection of the tidy villages its residents had left behind in Europe, and that they were now desperately trying to recreate in their new Detroit homes. So that, up here, this is the Federal Screwworks building. That's the Federal Screwworks building, so that's the plant. That's just a street scene from Detroit. And this is my father and my Aunt Helen and my Aunt Josie somewhere in the neighborhood on their bicycle. Well, they probably weren't all on the bicycle. They just posed for the picture. So this day, March the 30th, promised to be an unseasonably warm one as the members of the Drapinski family, Polish-born 49-year-old patriarch Alex, a molder for one of Detroit's auto manufacturers, his 40-year-old wife Martha, also Polish-born, who was a cigar maker, and their 7-year-old American-born daughter Marie went about preparing for their day. Though the couple had, as recently as 1930, been enumerated in the federal census as homeowners, the Drapinskis, like many of the others in the neighborhood, had seen their work hours dramatically diminished, and thus, too, their incomes as a result of the Great Depression. And they had joined the teeming ranks of transient tenants who lived on rent in the small bungalows, apartments, and two-story flats that surrounded the Federal Screw Works factory embedded deep within the neighborhood and situated on the corner of Martin and Otis, just north of the busy New York Central freight junction across Southern, now John Crunk. On this particular Wednesday, however, there was every indication that this would be a highly unusual day. And the neighborhood crackled with nervous energy as everyone awaited the start of the day shift at the Screw Works. For the previous 2 days, in response to an ongoing walkout at the plant triggered by a wage reduction impacting the bulk of Federal Screw's unionized workforce, they were only recently unionized, the United Automobile Workers pickets which were supplied by Walter Reuther's Local 174, which was the unit that represented the Federal Screw Workers, along with neighborhood residents, many of whom also worked in the factory, had gathered at both 7 a.m. and at 4 p.m. to harangue and attempt to obstruct a group of 30 hired strikebreakers from entering the factory and exiting it peacefully. They were accompanied to and from the factory by Detroit police officers who had been dispatched to the scene by anti-union Mayor Richard Redding and encouraged to render assistance by their notoriously conservative and anti-radical boss, Police Commissioner Heinrich A. Pickert. And they were looking at a reduction of 20 cents a day on both Monday and Tuesday, as the strikebreakers were marched down Martin from Michigan Avenue toward the plant, and then as their path was reversed at the end of their shift, these strikebreakers were accosted by insults and invective and occasionally rocks and other missiles hurled by pickets and by neighborhood residents, including a great many women and children. Those pushing too near the police escort found themselves dealing with the business end of police batons. Police Sergeant Daniel Lorimer reported, for instance, that quite a few heads were cracked. This included 43-year-old Polish-born Francis Bigosz, a resident of neighboring Edward Street, who was clubbed on the front porch of a friend's house across the street from the plant at 3434 Martin, which is now a vacant lot. They claimed that she had thrown a stone at the police officers. So she was beaten on the front porch of her friend's house in front of the disbelieving eyes of her neighbors and her 19-year-old daughter, Jean, who was also allegedly choked by the police officers. One responding officer was reported brandished his weapon, pointing it at a group of school children who were booing him and pelting him with stones as he assaulted Mrs. Bigosz. Wednesday morning unfolded much the same as the previous 2 days. Detroit police escorted a group of men down Martin toward the plant. Though the number of picketers was larger than on the previous 2 days, the strikebreakers were delivered safely to the factory and entered the plant with only minor incident. Throughout the day, however, Martha Drapinski could not have helped but notice a growing throng of outraged pickets and neighbors gathering near the plant and marching in front of it. By 4 o'clock, some 5,000 to 10,000 people crowded neighborhood streets, yards, porches, and even roofs surrounding Federal Screw Works. Throughout the day, Martha also watched and perhaps even lent a hand as many in the neighborhood many of the neighborhood women and children, anticipating trouble, gathered rocks, bottles, bricks, and other projectiles and stockpiled them on local porches, behind fences, and on rooftops. Detroit police responded in kind to this increased presence, assembling a force of 600 officers, including a tear gas squad and 35 mounted police officers. They were all on scene, and they cordoned off the area immediately around the plant. As the strikebreakers left the plant shortly after 4 p.m. that afternoon, under the guard of their police escort, it quickly became apparent that their route up Martin to Michigan Avenue was impassable. And so, after a quick consultation among commanders on the scene, the men were instead directed eastward along Otis toward Livernois. As the group of anxious strikebreakers began to hastily make their way along Otis, they were immediately met with a barrage of sticks, bottles, eggs, tomatoes, tin cans, stones, and outrage. Within seconds, the scene devolved into total chaos, with police, strikebreakers, picketers, and neighborhood residents falling upon one another. Police wielded their batons indiscriminately, striking men, women, and children, going so far as to chase some of the crowd up onto porches and residents into their own backyards. Neighborhood children used blowpipes and slingshots to pelt police officers and their horses with marbles and BBs, and reportedly rolled ball bearings down the street to make the horses lose their footing. An African-American participant in the action, UAW activist and nearby Clark Street Cadillac Assembly employee Percy Keyes, was, witnesses recounted later, after attempting to surrender himself to the police and with his arms lifted into the air, chased into a backyard on the corner of Clippert and Otis, and clubbed into unconsciousness by officers shouting, "Give it to the N-word." Keith suffered a broken back, an arm, and skull fracture. Just a short distance away, amidst a cacophony of shrieks and shouts, stunned residents watched in horror as a mounted police officer knocked an adolescent girl to the ground and then proceeded to dismount and beat her, breaking 3 of her ribs. When Wilfred Gruel, an auto worker who had traveled from his home in Pontiac in support of the strike, bent over to pick up the terrified girl, several officers clubbed him savagely about the head from behind without warning, fracturing his skull. So these street scenes, this is the strike breakers coming out of the factory. And this is the scene at Clippert and Otis. You can't see it, but just behind this, so I don't know if it's a tree or a pole here, to the left there's a street sign, and it says Clippert in a clear picture. And the strike breakers, you can see they're sort of huddled here. One of them's laying on the pavement, so something must have struck him. And they're trying to make their way down toward Livernois. Watching the melee swirl outside of her home and feeling her temper rising in response to the assault on her community, Martha Drapinski set a pot of water to boil in preparation for what might come. As she stared in disbelief and anger at the scene unfolding before her eyes, she noticed a man standing with a cane on the street in front of her. She immediately recognized the man as Stanley Novak, a local 174 union organizer. In fact, he was the lead organizer at Federal Screw, who her sister, who was a cigar maker at the General Cigar Factory in Hamtramck, had told her about. Novak, in fact, had hurt his foot jumping out of a window in the factory when he was trying to organize it the year before. Quickly moving into action, Martha rushed down her steps toward Novak. Grabbing his arm, she, as he describes it, half dragged, half carried him into the safety of her home, locking the door behind her. Her rescue, however, had been noticed by a mounted police officer, and the officer rapidly made his way toward her home. Running to her kitchen, Martha hurriedly grabbed the pot of scalding water off the stove, scrambled up the stairs to a front-facing window. Throwing up the window sash, she weaponized this symbol of domestic, submissiveness, and she hurled it out the window onto the police officer, who, of course, shrieked in pain and immediately retreated from the scene. She then she scolded Novak about being out on the street, and she locked him in an upstairs bedroom for his own safety. Novak was fortunate indeed, for while he was safely inside the Drapinski home, the street battle raged on around it unabated, spilling over into adjoining streets, alleyways, and yards. Detroit Evening Times reporter offered the following account. As the non-strikers came out of the plant, police formed a human corridor for them to pass through. 4 mounted officers led the parade of workers. They continued unmolested for about 50 feet. Then, as they passed an alley, and if you know the area, you know the alley they're talking about, bricks, clubs, and bottles began to fly. Mounted men charged into the booing crowd. There were about 125 police in double cordon. The march continued to Clippert Street, a block from the plant. Then the pickets began to hurl their signs, which were actually clubs with signs fastened to the ends. The police wall broke. Many pickets who had been parading up and down in front of the screwworks rushed into the melee. Amid the confusion of flying bricks, bottles, and clubs rose cries of, "Damn the police! Down with the police!" Mounted policemen's horses, struck by missiles, reared into the air and galloped through the throng. The crowd fell back in front of the horses. Police finally reformed their lines around the non-strikers, but bricks, clubs, bottles were still flying 3 blocks away from the plant. It took police 35 minutes to escort the non-strikers 3 blocks. As non-strikers left the protection of police, strike sympathizers chased them along through backyards, throwing rocks and clubs. Windows in parked cars were smashed by flying stones, and traffic on Livernois Avenue was disrupted. When the violence finally subsided, 45 minutes after it began, the grim toll of the day's struggle became clear to all, with some 40 picketers and neighborhood residents, nearly all of the strikebreakers, and 13 police officers hospitalized, with an untold number more treated by the UAW in its first aid station that they set up in an empty storefront on Martin, just north of the factory. And others, of course, were probably undoubtedly just treated within the confines of neighborhood homes. To this day, the strike at Federal Screwworks stands as the most violent strike in Detroit's long and fabled labor history. The story of the Polish community's role in building American unions, especially those like the UAW, which were established to represent the unskilled masses in the United States, that's a well-known story. A host of historians have shown how during the Great Depression, Polish workers turned to industrial unionism to protect their imperiled communities and used ethnic institutions to get their union organizing drives off the ground. The Depression hit Polish Americans harder than most other groups, setting them back in their struggle to achieve a minimum level of economic security and jeopardizing almost all of their earlier gains. And it did so by attacking 2 of the most important pillars of Polish American working class life: a secure job and a homestead, home ownership. That Detroit's Southwest Polish community experienced the traumas of the Great Depression is clear. A comparison of census records from the neighborhood census tracts in 1930 and 1940 reveals the loss of properties once owned, periods of unemployment, a fall in overall wages in many families, and intermittent periods of dependence upon public relief. My own family was on relief during that time period. In addition, unease intensified in the aftermath of the local press's 1936 disclosure of the existence in the city of a secretive, neo-fascist and stridently nativist organization known as the Black Legion, whose violent exploits revealed a willingness to employ brutality as a tool, and whose membership included many of Detroit's elites, including the police commissioner. These interconnected stresses shaped the neighborhood's response to the events of March 1938. As many in the community again found themselves facing the prospect of a diminished standard of living because of the proposed wage cut, and facing an assault upon their neighborhood by Pickard's police officers who were suppressing both the strike and the flow of daily life within the community. People couldn't leave their homes just to walk to the neighborhood store without police interference. While on its heels, this was also a community that was steeped in a tradition of collective action and defense of its values, both in Detroit and stretching back to the Galician province from which most of its residents emigrated. As one scholar, Keeley Stoddard Halstead, has argued, the number and range of civil institutions available to peasants expanded dramatically in post-emancipation Austrian Poland, making peasant participation in public life far greater here than in the Russian or Prussian partitions. So there was a heritage in Galicia of peasant action, of intense nationalistic rhetoric and political activism. So this created a population that was accustomed to local self-governance and collective agency, an agency that its members were not afraid to exercise in pursuit of both local goals or to promote political agendas that reflected neighborhood values, and that often transcended the immediate bounds of their immediate environment. This was the ethos of the Galician Poles who made Southwest Detroit their home in the early 20th century. It was the ethos that shaped the response to the strike at Federal Screw in March of 1938. Indeed, as one UAW activist presciently noted in the strike's aftermath, that is the strike, was more of a community cause than it was union, because all of the people from children on up helped us. UAW officials, particularly Walter Reuther, many of you have undoubtedly driven his expressway, recognized the centrality of the ethos of the community in the neighborhood surrounding Federal Screw. His union, Local 174, actively leveraged this cohesiveness and tailored union organizing to dovetail with existing community structures. So he employed Polish-born Stanley Novak as a community organizer. He held union meetings in local neighborhood meeting places, including bars. He encouraged the election of community residents as union stewards. He utilized Polish language radio broadcasts and newspapers to disseminate the union's message. And he leveraged the power of the church to distribute union literature. This strategy bore fruit, leading a UAW official to note that Local 174, quote, was as much a community organization as a collective bargaining institution. This symbiosis between the union and the community paid dividends in 1938, bringing to bear the collective strength of the neighborhood and ensuring that the UAW survived its highly contested infancy. So activism was not a new thing in Detroit's Polish West Side community by the 1930s. On the contrary, Poles initiated several major protests arising from both labor strife and strained relations between themselves and the local Catholic leaders in the years before 1938. For instance, in 1905, Poles at St. Hedwig Parish, and there's St. Hedwig at the top there, joined together to assert local control over parish matters. Here, parishioners sought the replacement of Reverend Francis Mueller, a Prussian-born Pole whose dialect they had a difficult time understanding. They were also upset with some of the decisions that he had made relative to expenditures of church construction funds, which had been contributed by area residents. Congregants demanded Mueller's removal and actively withheld church records, leading diocesan officials in the city of Detroit to excommunicate church trustees for refusing to acknowledge church authority. In response, 200 local men and women angrily assembled outside of the church to defend their peers. Police were dispatched to disperse the crowd. Compromise measures were then undertaken by church leadership to resolve outstanding issues. This incident stood as a touchstone to the local Polish community, reflecting both the tradition and the effectiveness of collective action. The Great Depression amplified this collective action and turned it in a more stridently political direction. In 1935, for instance, a woman by the name of Mary Zook, a resident of the East Side Polish enclave of Hamtramck, organized a meat strike over the course of that summer with the aim at reducing the price of that commodity by 20%. And here are the meat strikers. Zook and her colleagues publicly and sometimes violently took to the streets. They literally would attack people who come out of butcher shops, beat them up, and take the meat away from them. They remonstrated at City Hall. They eventually made their way to Washington, D.C. in an audience with Secretary of Agriculture Henry Wallace. Among Zook's most active allies was a woman named Catherine Mudra, who resided just up Martin Street from Federal Screwworks. Mudra led her neighborhood's Women's Committee Against the High Cost of Living to enforce meat boycotts at shops throughout the West Side neighborhood. That Mudra's neighbors and friends, many of whom likely participated in the meat strike, but all of whom were aware of it and of Mudra's well-publicized leadership of the strike, similarly took to the streets a little less than 3 years later and acted in a very public way to highlight their concerns and to demand change and to defend their neighborhood should not come then as any great surprise. Yet another action that undoubtedly influenced the 1938 federal screw strikers and their supporters was the 1937 cigar strike in the city of Detroit. Beginning in January of that year, 4,000 women, primarily from Detroit's Polish community, women like Martha Drapinski and her sister, agitated for themselves, their families, and their communities when they launched a sit-down strike at cigar factories across the city. As the strike turned violent and spread to other local industries, Michigan Governor Frank Murphy interceded, calling the company and union officials together on April the 22nd. The next day, all of Detroit's cigar shops had a union contract. These myriad actions set the stage for the March 1938 riot. Now, Poles played a central role in the unionization of the Federal Screwworks plant in February of 1938. So just little over a month before the strike. Given that the majority of the plant's workforce hailed from the immediate neighborhood, 40% of them were female. Having Polish support was a necessity if organizing the factory was to succeed. Threatened by the company with a 20% pay cut and having witnessed the plant's workforce halved in recent months, Federal Screw employees reached out to Stanley Novak for assistance in organizing the plant early in 1938. Very quickly, enough membership cards had been signed to call a meeting. At this meeting, 150 men and women formally voted to join Local 174. The negotiating committee was then elected to bargain with Federal Screw Works management for union recognition and a contract. At the bargaining session, attorney Oscar Marcus, who represented the company, rejected every single employee demand and informed the negotiating team that, quote, things have changed in the city of Detroit. Labor is going to be put in its place, and any strikes, sit down or otherwise, will no longer be tolerated. Despite this warning, workers voted on February the 23rd to strike if management went ahead with its threatened pay cut. After the company rejected union offers to take a temporary cut in the form of a loan, Federal Screw Workers set a March 28th strike deadline. The die was cast, but the ground that the soon-to-be striking workers stood on was unsteady at best. The decade of 1937 to 1947 is often described as one of civil war within the United Automobile Workers Union. As the union's progressive caucus, led by its first president, Homer Martin, battled the left-leaning Walter Reuther-led Unity Caucus. That doesn't even include the communist element here. This struggle hindered the union's ability to combat the hostility of corporations. Hostility intensified in the aftermath of the dramatic gains made by the union as a result of the sit-down strikes that led to union recognition in many of Detroit's leading industrial corporations, including General Motors, in early 1937. Hoping to take advantage of divided union leadership, contending with a sharp economic downturn, General Motors worked over the summer of 1937 to regain the upper hand and to assert company authority over its workforce. Spurred to greater action yet by the election of pro-business Republican Richard Redding as mayor in the city of Detroit in November of 1937, Detroit's corporate community, led by GM, determined to bring the union to its knees. Companies quickly laid off workers and cut work hours. By January of 1938, GM had either laid off its workers or slashed their hours to no more than 2 per week, thereby forcing the Martin-led progressive UAW caucus, which was then leading the union, into concessions. In early 1938, GM also actively encouraged, and some contended bankrolled, wage cuts and work hour reductions by its unionized suppliers, such as Federal Screw. These actions put the UAW's very existence in peril. The infighting within the UAW and the oft-heard charge of labor unions as anti-American induced Homer Martin to try to rid his union of the taint of communism, whose existence threatened the nascent union due to the intense hostility against radicals pervasive in the nation at the time. Martin's attack resonated with many in the Polish community who had a latent hostility to the authoritarianism and the strident secularism its members associated with communism. That communism was also linked with the Soviet Union, against which the new Polish state had gone to war in 1919 to 1921, also sat uncomfortably in the minds of many Detroit Poles, leading many to question whether union participation was palatable. Finally, the anti-communist harangues of Detroit's popular radio priest, Charles Coughlin, and other community leaders, as well as corporate usage of the communist moniker to disparage all unionists, gave many pause when considering whether to join or stand by the UAW. An obstacle that Reuther and his team worked diligently to counter in order to preserve the inroads his local union had made against Detroit's industrialists. That the union succeeded in overcoming these forces and winning the affinity of the federal screw neighborhood, despite its very real fears and concerns in the early months of 1938, is undeniable. The story of Helena Grandesa is illustrative. Grandesa, a 22-year-old employee of the Screw Works and a neighborhood resident, and the mother of someone who was going to be here, but he couldn't be here today, directly confronted this concern when deciding whether to participate in the March 28th strike. Encouraged by a friend to come out and participate, Helena was reticent to do so because she'd heard that unions were communist organizations. Her father, however, who worked at the non-unionized Rouge plant, assured her that this was not true, that the union was a good thing, that it had no connection to communism. With this reassurance in hand, Helena joined her girlfriend and other co-workers in the strike. Her story was not an isolated one. Myriad federal screw employees and area residents grappled with these concerns. But when pressed, they too exercised their individual agency and joined the crusade. Margaret Collingwood Novak, the wife of Stanley Novak, recounted that on the first day of the strike, as strikebreakers approached the factory, angry women from nearby porches and sidewalks shouted at both police and scabs and hurled names and shook their fists. As the police headed back toward Michigan Avenue after depositing the strikebreakers inside the factory, the enraged women again shouted insults from sidewalks and porches, even the children joining in. The police rushed after some of the women with clubs, chasing them even onto their own porches to strike at them. The following day, she continued, the spirit of the neighborhood and strikers was remarkable. If anything, their fighting spirit had been strengthened. Walter Reuther also recounted how those who stood on the picket line in the rain outside of Federal Screw on the second day were clubbed on the hands and arms in the police attempt to break the picket line. As another witness recalled, both the attitude of the police and the number of them was anything but American. This attitude on the part of police extended not only to those engaged in the picket line, but also to innocent bystanders and neighbors. On the strike's final day, residents physically confronted the strike breakers and the police officers who protected them, with many resulting arrests. Collingwood Novak recalled, the police proceeded with their charges down the middle of Otis Street, and suddenly women on porches and roofs began hurling sticks, stones, milk bottles, tin cans, eggs, tomatoes, anything they could lay their hands on. Some even threw pails of boiling water. She proudly added, the workers took their cue from the women, and the fight was on. Such a fight has never been seen before in Detroit. And so here's some of the scenes. This is on the corner of Seacott and Otis. It's kind of blurry because it's from the newspaper. This is a story that was recounted very widely. A blonde woman confronting police officers in an alley perhaps the alley between Martin and Clippert. But nonetheless, she was reported across the country. Locals supported the strike and neighborhood resistance in lots of ways. Obviously, there's the direct participation in the strike, but others like Mariana Janzarek, a 43-year-old mother of three residing at 6652 Otis, which was less than 1 block from the screw works and in the epicenter of the violence on March 30th. After witnessing her yard become a bloody battleground, she unhesitatingly offered eyewitness testimony of police violence before a state legislative committee in June 1938. Pretty brave thing to do. This English was not her first language, and, who knows what kind of retribution she might face. Still others, such as Stella Jakowski, who's pictured here in the center, triaged the wounded and treated injured strikers and residents at the UAW's first aid station, with other local women staffing the strike kitchen preparing stew, coffee, and sandwiches for the picketers. This collective action and the assertiveness of the neighborhood manifest during the strike and the ensuing riot offered clear expressions of agency emanating from a population that was often broadly dismissed as docile and subservient. On the day after the rioting, a neighborhood woman confronted Police Commissioner Pickert following an agitated city council meeting where the riot had featured prominently. Challenging a ticket that had been issued to her during the melee by Detroit police officers, she thrust the ticket into the commissioner's face. Pickert agreed to look into the matter. "And what about my shaking nerves?" yelled the woman. Pickert, without hesitation, retorted, "Seems to me you have plenty of nerve." Now, Pickert's strident response to this working-class poll was intended to dismiss her and to put her, and by extension her community, in its place. Pickert's quip, coming as it did in the aftermath of this neighborhood action, is also very telling, as it speaks to deep-seated social and cultural expectations and assumptions held about the Polish working class in Detroit. It was unfathomable for many to conceive of a reality where these demure Poles might have participated in such bold and defiant behavior. Other eyewitness accounts similarly noted behavior that did not comport with what was considered normal. The Detroit News, for instance, highlighted the fact that women and children joined in the melee and shouted maledictions at the police. Girls of high school age picked up stones and clubs and threw them at mounted officers. Taken as a whole, such press coverage and the intense rhetoric delivered a clear message that for those defending the status quo, that those who participated in the strike and the ensuing violence against police, who were a tangible symbol, of course, of the existing social, economic, and political order, that they'd crossed a line in relation to what was deemed acceptable behavior. Accordingly, these Poles had to be taken to task on the factory floor, in the streets of Detroit, in the press, in the halls of city government, for challenging that order. When you see women throw bricks and hot water out of the windows of their homes at the police, Walter Reuther pointedly noted, then there must be something wrong. The horrific spectacle of the federal screw riot of March 30th, 1938, and the relative sympathy the union was winning throughout Detroit brought the strike to a speedy conclusion. In the face of a public relations fiasco and with the threat of continued labor action looming, Federal Screw's leaders agreed to call off the police, close the plant, and negotiate a new contract with Local 174. The two sides quickly hammered out an agreement, which was signed on April the 9th. In the end, the threatened wage cut was not implemented, and the UAW was recognized as the bargaining unit for Federal Screw employees. The union victory had a tremendous ripple effect, and it provided the UAW with renewed life and greater resiliency in its ongoing struggle with Detroit's automakers. Federal Screw was, quote, not a conflict and a contest over the maintenance of civic order, but rather, historian Nelson Lichtenstein contends, a confrontation with those who sought to disrupt the new system of economic justice the UAW had begun to impose on the industrial landscape. This new system of economic justice breathed new life and hope into Detroit's Polish community, and the response to the threat to it at Federal Screw speaks to their desperation to protect and preserve it. This defensive struggle and the union's effort to expand economic justice was far from over in 1938, but the workers at Federal Screw, along with their allies in the surrounding neighborhood, had won a vital victory, one that would turn the tide in favor of the fledgling union. In doing so, the Poles of Southwest Detroit ensured that the struggling UAW would live to fight another day, and that their local community would continue to provide the residents as much opportunity and security as depression-riddled America would allow. And I ended here with, this is a medal that was given to the young woman, Helena, by Walter Reuther for her participation in the strike. It still remains in the family, still a point of pride for the family. And again, it says, the officers of your international union appreciate your loyalty in the fight to improve, or I forget what this says, but something labor conditions. So that's the story of the Federal Screw strike. Okay, thank you.